Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Director of Regulatory Strategy, Licensing and Policy with Lockheed Martin Government Affairs, Ryan Terry, to the stage.
So we put Ryan in the middle, maybe. Where do you want to be?
Do you want to sit in the middle and we'll flank you?
How about I'll take the center? Good afternoon, intrepid visitors. We appreciate that when you see an invitation to come talk regulation and policy, it means you're hardcore. I'm delighted to be with two good friends here who have traveled from different locales to make this possible. And rather than doing a typical reading of a bio, I'm going to encourage both Julie and Joanne to offer some comments about their background and particularly about what their organizations do. But at the outset, it seems appropriate to acknowledge in all seriousness the extent to which regulation, clear guidance, firm policy is foundational to a framework to enable operations, the operations of which we're discussing today, being lunar. But that is the case across the whole space domain. And in that regard, it's important to appreciate the extent to which both the domestic regulatory environment and the international regulatory and policy environment come together and are married in an important way. I hope by the end of this conversation we may have identified the means by which there is kind of an end-to-end continuity between what domestic administrations are proceeding to do in the lunar regulatory sphere and what the international community in its regulatory and policy capacity is fulfilling. So that's a hope. We're primarily going to be speaking about the means by which communication systems themselves are regulated, and that is in the context of traditional communications links, positioning, navigation, and timing, P&T being another form, and we're going to be very conscientious about abbreviations and acronyms. We're all from Washington, so that becomes part of our lifestyle. And at the same time, thinking about how these critical links ultimately will enable and spur an entire form of innovation that will be fulfilled in the lunar ecosystem. So that sets us out.
Great.
And Julie, thank you for joining.
Thank you.
As chief of the newly formed Space Bureau, it's exciting to see the extent to which the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, has added an emphasis on space as opposed to what was traditionally just called international. Can you share some of the chairwoman's vision in that regard and how you're fulfilling that as the lead of the Bureau who has responsibility in regulating this from the perspective of U.S. applicants?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for being here today. This room is massive. We will try to fill it, and there's a bit of an echo, so thank you for your patience as we navigate some of the acoustics in the room as well. But thank you, Ryan, for the kind introduction, and it's an honor to be here with you and with Joanne. And thank you to AIAA and the Ascend organizers for the opportunity to talk about the FCC and satellite and space communications issues. We do like, as a bunch of communications lawyers and engineers, to toss around a lot of space jokes, and we're happy that space is the place. And I really am honored to be here representing the FCC, the Space Bureau, as its first chief. You asked a little bit about sort of what was the vision. So we were launched on April 11th of this year with a reorg of the International Bureau of the FCC into an Office of International Affairs and a Space Bureau, a standalone, all by ourselves Space Bureau, to work with our communications colleagues, our satellite companies on commercial licensing. The FCC chairwoman has long been a champion of how satellite communications can transform connectivity and economic opportunities. So let me talk to you a little bit about, for those of you who aren't familiar with FCC licensing, I do see some friends in the audience with whom we spend a lot of time. But the FCC's authority to regulate commercial satellite communications derives from the Communications Act of 1934, yes, before there were such things as satellites. And this was amended by the Telecommunications Act of 1996, lovingly known in Washington as the Lawyers' Lifetime Employment Act. And the mandate of the FCC is to license radio communications within the US, issue regulations to prevent interference, setting licensing requirements for non-federal stations, and we also have authority to grant licenses in the public interest and carry out provisions of the Act for those and those in international treaties that relate to radio communications. And I should note that our authority is pretty broad, but it's not limitless, and we know that. But our licensing procedures are governed by Part 47 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 47, woohoo! And this relates to commercial, Part 25, commercial licensing, experimental licensing, amateur radio, and other issues that are near and dear to the hearts of many. So why is this all important? We have seen the growth of commercial satellite communications grow exponentially in the last few years in particular. And the thought is, as we have more new entrants, particularly with low Earth orbit, we believe that it's time to update our rules, but also how we present ourselves to the world. And I'll turn it over. I don't want to suck all the air out of this very large room, but those are some of the things that make the FCC Space Bureau what it is, and we'll talk a little more in detail, but we are your U.S. commercial satellite licensing agency.
You know, I was thinking, Julie, about my experience in the 1990s when we moved from government-owned satellite systems to privately owned satellite systems, and the extent to which we're again at one of these pivot spaces where the whole concept, and I think maybe later we can talk some about satellite and communications capabilities as a service, because we're moving away from the bespoke systems, and it seems like we're at one of those threshold moments again, in the way that the regulations in effect have to catch up with a variety of business models that have shifted.
Exactly, and we'll talk about those a little bit more. My team, by the way, has 56,000 applications before it right now pending for large NGSO satellite, non-geostationary systems. So if that tells you anything, that is double the number of applications filed in 2019. So yes, having our own bureau and building our staff is really important.
I appreciate that. I see that a question came in about the World Radio Conference 23. Rest assured, we're getting there.
Wait, what? What's it called? That little thing?
Speaking of which, Joanne, thank you for joining us. As director of the Radiocommunication Bureau, you are the deputy to said director.
Yes.
And the BR.
We just gave her a promotion.
Just, right, exactly. The BR, as we lovingly call it internally, is a mystical creature, but it's one that everyone here can appreciate and understand because of the impact, obviously. Would you share with us some of the functions of the ITU generally, the International Telecommunication, no S, Union, and specifically as it relates to what we're talking about today?
Thank you very much. Well, Julie started off talking about, the background for the FCC. Well, the ITU's background goes a little bit further back.
It's true.
Just a little.
So the ITU initially stood for the International Telegraph Union, and it was founded in 1865. So we're going back a little ways.
Wow.
And the first radio regulations were adopted as the International Radio Telegraph Convention, and that was in 1906. So, we have an older history, and in fact, the ITU, as it's currently formed in terms of the International Telecommunications Union, was the combination of those two, and that was in 1932 at that convention, and finally the ITU took its name in 1934. We became a UN agency when the UN was created,
Right.
so in 1947. So we actually predated the UN, and we're twice as old as the United Nations. The ITU, in the context of radio communications, has an important mission because we are a treaty-based, so we establish binding regulation on the use of the radio spectrum. It addresses both terrestrial and space, and in fact, the initial reason for the radio regulations, so going back to late 1800s and early 1900s, was more for maritime communications. The fact that we were putting ships at sea, and then you had disasters like the Titanic, where it became very clear that we needed to use our resources in a way to ensure safety of life. So the first treaties and so forth were really to address the issue of maritime safety. And then as time has gone on, as we have broadcast technologies and we have radio conferences in order to do broadcasting, and then subsequently with Sputnik in 1954, and then Telstar after that, and in terms of the US and others starting to get into communications from space. Then we had a space conference, an extraordinary conference in 1963, where we first allocated spectrum for use in space. So, like I said, we're a little bit older than all of the UN. And I think the thing that I'm surprised about oftentimes is how little people understand about how all of the various radio services that they use are actually regulated at the international level. So the purpose of the radio communications sector and bureau is to promote the efficient, equitable use of the radio spectrum in order to provide equitable access for all countries, and to be able to operate all these various radio systems without causing harmful interference into each other. And so now we've regularized every 4 years. We have a World Radio Conference where we look at aspects of the treaty and make updates to it in order to be able to bring new services, new applications, new technologies into the international regulatory framework. And then that sets the basis upon which the national authorities do their licensing and their regulation. So that's sort of, hopefully, I don't know if that's high level enough. But basically we set the framework against which everyone else operates in order to ensure that all these different radio systems can operate effectively without causing harmful interference.
And there are currently
193 member states.
193 member states
Of the UN. And so the other thing, and I think it's because we talk about space regulation, and as my good friend Audrey likes to say, we do space law in terms of regulation every 4 years when we update the radio regulations. But the radio regulations themselves are an administrative regulation on top of the ITU Constitution. And it's that combination of the Constitution and the obligations that it imposes on the member states, and then the radio regulations and the use of the specific frequencies. It's that combination that sets the framework for international use of the radio spectrum.
And that point of a framework, and in this regard, it gets to the heart of one of the earlier comments I made about the interconnection, if you will, the link between a domestic administration and its regulatory authority and the international agreements to which it's also subject. Frameworks, if you're in my line of work, which is to enable operations for a licensee for a large entity, they bring the regulatory certainty that we crave, because in addition to there being a clear path for securing the authority that one needs in order to initiate operations, it's also an important signal we've come to appreciate increasingly for the investment community. to recognize that in the form of an instrument that grants you authority to conduct a particular mission, there's of course also the benefit of ensuring that you are doing so in a regularized manner.
Can I add a little bit to
Please
that?
do.
Because one of the things I think it's also important to understand is that regulatory assurance also at the international level, so for space systems, for terrestrial systems that may need to be protected from interference from from international use by other countries, the radio regulations provides you with international recognition. Mm-hmm. It says that if my system is registered in the Master International Frequency Registry, then anyone causing harmful interference to me must cease that interference. I have a mechanism to ensure that I can continue to operate without receiving harmful interference. So it's not just that the regulation is stable, but also that the rights that I have as a user of the radio spectrum are assured because of my application of the regulation. So if I'm compliant, and I then have the ability to require that anyone else who is operating, if it interferes with my recognized operations, that has to be suspended, that has to be eliminated.
And when you talk about the investment community, I think to your point, if you're putting something up that's costing millions or billions of dollars, you want assurance that that service that you're offering, right, or whatever function you're doing is going to work. So there are those protection mechanisms as well that are so important. While
at the same time reinforcing that principle of equity that you were outlining as being fundamental to the ITU's work. I'm interested, Julie, as we talk about this notion of frameworks and regulatory certainty, the extent to which the FCC is headed in a particular direction. Wondering, again, reinforcing the importance of the signal of what a space bureau is. There is a broad appetite I can see in the way of what's submitted at the FCC, both in the experimental service as well as the traditional Part 25 international service. For authority to conduct operations, including now lunar.
Right.
So I'm wondering the volume with which you all and the staff are seeing incoming applications with a lunar emphasis.
Right.
And how is the commission moving forward in leadership role in that particular domain?
Yeah, this is great. So I should again point to my colleague, Joanne. She mentioned the Telstar 1 satellite, which was the first commercial satellite, which was, I guess, successful in part due to the FCC. So really excited to hear you mention Telstar. But in terms of what is new at the Commission, so the new Space Bureau, we're looking at some initiatives that will help existing processes. So Part 25 streamlining, putting applications on public notice sooner, having more opportunities for transparency. We have a workshop coming up on November 1st. There's a public notice today, and the first workshop of our transparency initiative will be on space stations. We'll also put out a number of documents for probably mostly to the benefit of newer entrants, but for the seasoned experts, this will probably be helpful as well. But you mentioned things like lunar and the volume. So we've seen a huge number of applications, not just for satellite licenses or space stations and NGSOs, but we've also seen it for Earth stations. But then we have these applications for lunar, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Lockheed has an application pending with us for lunar. Intuitive Machines actually has just been granted its first lunar communications license, the first the Commission has granted. So, and then there are two others, Astrobotic, and there's another one as well. But Intuitive Machines was granted a couple weeks ago, so that was our first grant for a lunar comms application. Not commenting on any of the others, but we have seen this growth in communications involving, things like space tugs or space antenna farms, and we'll see more of these novel space activities. And I think the view of the Bureau and the chairwoman is we need to be responsive and have a way to process applications like this quickly and to adjust our rules, many of which are very baked from a few decades ago, but that we need to be able to respond. So we have an ISAM, in-service assembly and manufacturing notice of inquiry, where we have received comments. That period has closed, but we're now working on what is the next step, which is called a notice of proposed rulemaking. We've reviewed all of our comments, and it's not that the commission should regulate, but should we regulate the communications piece, the spectrum piece of those newer and novel applications? So we'll have more questions and proposed rules on the role that we should take, or maybe we shouldn't take. So we're trying not to presuppose an outcome. I think we'd prefer to be less regulatory than more regulatory. But again, as part of our transparency process, we want to make sure that the decisions we're making have a lot of input from stakeholders, so we can continue to craft rules that are actually positive and forward-thinking.
I like to think of it, we say internally at Lockheed, it's smart regulation. The extent to which, as we established at the outset, that regulation and good regulation is an imperative for the predictability. It's finding that balance. And I'm going to pose this question to you, Joanne, as well, but I'm thinking first domestically. Is it the sense, Julie, that the rules are there, they need to be adapted perhaps to some of these novel constructs? I think that certain applicants are pushing the boundaries with regard to how the rules are stated today under Title 47. But is it the general sense within the Bureau that the framework is still there and the framework is effective?
Oh, we're not throwing the rules out. We think that the framework is effective, but we know that the volume has increased such, and then we have a lot of applications that are bespoke. They're,
Exactly.
It's your typical application with a twist. So what we're finding is that are our rules keeping up? So we'll be asking a lot of questions as we go through our transparency process too. Are the rules keeping up? Do we need to tweak them? I think there probably isn't a great desire to just pitch them and say, we're the Wild West. ITU probably wouldn't be so happy with that either. But I think our rules do work, but we need to make sure that they're meeting the current volume and the current application constructs that we're getting.
Because that seems key. And Joanne, thinking internationally in the same context, framework exists to accommodate requests that come from the states for coordination and otherwise. How is the ITU preparing, with an emphasis on lunar, but especially for the new and novel? And is it the view that the radio regs themselves are effective today for being able to enable these operations without some kind of wholesale change?
Well, certainly, like I said, the radio regulations on top of the Constitution.
Right.
Okay, so it establishes table of allocations. It allocates frequencies to different types of radio services. It establishes the requirements for the use of those. So each service allocation is complemented with a footnote that gives technical parameters for that. Whether or not coordination is required or not for a particular application, particularly the space-based applications, or terrestrial if it's frequencies where the likelihood of interfering with your neighbor is high. But then the implementation of that, okay, is done in two parts. One is in terms of the registration of frequencies for which you seek international recognition. And that's through the administrations to the ITU. Okay, so individual companies don't come to the ITU to seek a frequency assignment. They go through their regulatory authority. And then the implementation of the rules, the regulations by the national authority. So the FCC on behalf of the United States, and along with NTIA, because you have a different spectrum management construction here as compared to other countries.
Yes, indeed.
But the national authorities are responsible for the execution of the radio regulations. And then, like I said, go back to the ITU Constitution, and then that is also where, for instance, issues of infringement. One country is required to address if it's viewed as being infringing on the rights of another. So there's obligations between the countries under the treaty, but the application is actually done. Execution is done by the national authorities, and consistent across the framework. Then when issues come up of, one administration receiving harmful interference into another, from another, then you end up with issues coming before the Radio Regulations Board, where we try, with the assistance of the Bureau, try to help resolve that issue, recognizing that countries do have to live up to their treaty obligations. So are the current regulations sufficient to address all of the future? Probably not, but that's why we have radio conferences. Right. Because we can ask the questions, consider the possible allocations to different services, or consider, issues like in the last conference dealt with the mega constellations, and how do we ensure that, those constellations do not result in spectrum being warehoused. So every conference sets the agenda for the next conference and the preliminary agenda for the conference after that. And so we can look at issues and study them, which is, I think, the other important part of the ITU's work, is that we have a preparatory process. We can do the technical studies that underpin the regulations. And that, most importantly, probably, is that technical preparatory process includes the private sector. So we have sector members, companies like yours, and others can come and participate and provide their studies and make their proposals in the context of the preparatory work that leads to making good, sound technical decisions at conferences.
Well, you opened the door to the World Radio Conference. So I think we know our next topic. And as we transition to the theme of spectrum access, in order to enable these services, in addition to there being a dependable regulatory process generally for securing an authorization, we look, of course, to knowing, based on the table of allocations and otherwise, what spectrum's available. As everyone is preparing for Dubai, mid-November, what do you see as consequential to this community with regard to Work 23? Are there particular agenda items, as they're called, that would be relevant here? I'm sure there are. And any bans or any use of spectrum itself subject to that?
Actually, probably the most interesting item maybe for this audience might be the proposal for an agenda item for the next conference, specifically on lunar communications. Right. And I think that's probably going to lead to some of the most interesting technical and preparatory work that the ITU will have done in a while. Because if you look at the time frame it takes to build out a space economy and so forth, you can see that as sort of like the next step that's going to be a building block to future approaches to regulation of spectrum, not just on the lunar surface, but then on other planetary bodies as well. So we talk about this session is on Space 2050. Well, between now and then there's a few conferences ahead, but we need to start looking at what are the questions that we need to ask, what are the technical studies that we need to do, how can we build a framework, not just going one step after the next, but maybe step back and look at 2-3 conferences out, what would be the interesting topics, so that it lines up with the technical advancements that people are envisioning and the new services and requirements for a space economy you're looking at in the 2040, 2050 timeframe.
Can you help our colleagues appreciate what it means to have a future agenda item?
Probably the biggest argument of the conference is what the next conference is going to deal with. That is, so every conference establishes, like I said, the agenda of the next conference and a preliminary agenda for the conference after that. In fact, one of the items that I think was on the preliminary agenda for the 2027 conference, and probably, hopefully, will be established as an agenda item, is one on space weather sensors,
Right.
and whether or not we can recognize those devices and include them within the context of, you know, the regulatory framework, or how do we bring data back from them and make use of it. So every conference has, you know, it's agenda item 10. It's, you know, what should the next conference do and the next conference after that, and that's where people have some of the hottest debates, because then that's going to establish what's going to be, what the next 4 and 8 years are going to look like.
That's right.
In terms of the work of the industry and the agencies.
And the work for WARC 27 will start in January.
No, it'll start. Actually, it'll start the day after the WRC 23 is over. So on that Friday, the conference is over, and on Monday we hold we have the conference preparatory meeting for the next conference.
No rest for the weary there.
No rest for the weary.
So I was going to add something
Please
too
do.
as well. So some of the work that's happening here, I neglected to mention that the FCC did revise our rules for small satellites for beyond Earth type communications. So we have a streamlined small sat process for that. But also, I think probably of interest to you is the NASA and Aerospace Corporation cooperation on something called COSMIC that is looking at these beyond Earth functions, and we're actively involved in that. And I think obviously the ITU and other international communities will probably be interested in some of the work that comes out of that. So certainly taking our views up to the celestial, knowing that there is a lot of work to be done and a lot of expertise to be contributed to the process.
Yeah. Let me also take the opportunity to have one commercial.
We'll pause for this commercial break.
Pause
Yes.
for this commercial break, because the ITU just published our handbook on small satellites.
Yes.
And,
It was
and
great.
it's free. It's a free download from the ITU's website, but it provides all of the regulatory information for how should you, what do you need to do to license your satellite. So you go through your national authority, of course, but you do need a frequency assignment from the ITU. So I do want to give a commercial for our new small satellite handbook.
And can I do a further commercial?
Sure.
Let's keep this theme going.
There's a lot of love in this room. We enjoy the work that we do with the ITU, and as an administration member, we appreciate the fact that we have our application process, and we work with you all, and we do our coordination, and we make our stakeholders feel that they've got some comfort in having interference-free communications. So
I like that.
it's not every day.
I like that. That is collaboration in its best form. I want to touch briefly with you, Julie, on spectrum access and what the Commission is doing. But before we do that, there has been a great deal of interest in your reference to 50,000 applications. The question brought...
Some of them are large NGSO, yes.
So I knew
Not
that.
Not individual, but there are large constellations.
So I think you'll want to clarify that, as you just did. And a question is posed about how your organization is actively working new processes all the same to accommodate different market demands and this influx of applications. And to that point, that's the number of actual satellites that's contemplated by a variety of different applications, which are still many.
Right, it's still a lot. So how are we managing these?
Are you actively working new processes to accommodate market demands and managing so many applications?
Well, as I mentioned, we are streamlining to get applications that come in on our public notice system as quickly as possible. And we are hiring more staff. So we have, yes. So we are up to 57 people, and we started the year, I think, with about 40. So the staff is increasing, more people are coming in, and we are doing what we can to meet the needs of this growing industry. And Commissioner Sinington, who I am very honored to be filling in for today, had recommended somewhere that the FCC Space Bureau needs 100 engineers. I'm only repeating what he said in a few speeches, but throwing that out there.
A further commercial, as
I'm
it
only
was.
repeating what one of our commissioners said, but we applauded.
Fully understood. I'm contemplating that we've got 9 minutes, and I think it would be beneficial for us to explore, as a couple of questions have come in about sustainability, orbital debris. But first, was there anything with regard to current activity at the FCC, Julie, identifying spectrum bands for satellites, for space services that you wanted to highlight?
I think there's probably nothing at this point. I do note that SIA, the Satellite Industry Association, put out a report a week or two ago requesting, I think, 15 megahertz of spectrum for satellite. I may be misquoting them, but does that sound about right?
Yeah.
That sounds about right. This is not an endorsement of the report. I'm just noting that it is out there. But as far as we're concerned, we're always looking.
Always looking. Glad to hear that.
With our partners.
Indeed. Thinking now, as a couple of questions have come through about orbital debris, the extent to which the Commission has undertaken actively through potential rulemaking activity, making more comprehensive the current orbital debris regime. Also, stewardship generally, space stewardship. I'd be interested, Julie, and then would turn to Joanne for a similar question, to explore what, A, the Commission's doing in this regard, but B, is there a whole of government approach? We've got the Office of Space Commerce. We have a number of different functions within the executive, outside of an independent agency like the FCC, that are asserting policy positions and priorities with regard to space and space stewardship and space management, traffic management. Could you wrap all that into an answer?
I give you a quick nugget. So the FCC has been regulating or have had requirements for orbital debris mitigation since 2004. So we've been doing this for a very long time. We've been doing it before it was cool. And we recently updated our approach to shorten the time for decades-old rules, 25-year guidelines. We have shortened the guidelines for satellites to deorbit, and that is now 5 years. So we take orbital debris and sustainability very seriously. In terms of what other parts of the government are doing, there's a lot of communication happening between the FCC and an interagency. There also has been work that has happened with the National Space Council as well. So there's a lot of discussion going on with our agency partners and others. I would say we speak a lot. There is no sort of one rule that guides them all, but there is a lot of attention turned to the FCC's new rules. And we also just had our first ever orbital debris fine issued against DISH a few weeks ago. And I think that has resonated across the world. We had friends who were in Baku, Azerbaijan at the International Aeronautic Conference who took note that this has happened in the US, that is the first of its kind. So I think in terms of working with our agency partners, we're thrilled that we're in a constant dialogue, and I know that the work will continue. So I can't forecast what will come out of all of the work, but there is a great deal of attention being paid, and I think we all take it very seriously and know that it's a shared responsibility in the government.
Appreciate that. And thinking, Joanne, then on the international side, the whole of the universe, in fact, the extent to which the ITU is actively considering stewardship issues. A question came through, ancillary question, about what mechanisms are in place to ensure enforcement in an operational setting like the moon, if in fact there were a party who were committing an infraction. I'll let you do what you want with that one. But thinking about the role of the ITU with regard to stewardship, some of these traffic management questions, but more specifically perhaps to the moon, ensuring the continued accountability for maintaining a pristine environment.
So a couple of things. Well, first, I always want to sort of draw the line between the ITU's mandate, our role and responsibility, and others. Okay, because there are a number of different frameworks and regulatory and policy regimes with respect to activities in space. So the ITU's involvement is with respect to communications, specifically frequency, the use of radio spectrum in space. So we have a sister UN organization, okay, so UNUSA, UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, that deals with a number of things, including has the registry for objects in space, and so they are more, I like to draw the line between frequency assignments versus space, or versus objects. So debris, mitigation of debris, avoidance of collisions. So now we're talking about the management of objects in space as opposed to the management of the use of radio frequencies in space. So I think it's important for us to I don't want to say stay within our lanes, but certainly respect the boundaries between our organization's work and the work of other UN organizations. In that context, we often hear people suggesting that the ITU should have a broader role, or that the ITU's approach is something that should be considered by others. I don't think we have the resources or the technical expertise to take on another role. But I think we have a body of experience, 156 years if you're looking at the ITU in general, 117 years if you're looking specifically at Radiocommunications, a lot of experience in how such a binding regulatory authority can be established and operate in the context of. So what I think about is what are some of the things the ITU has, what I'll say the ITU has done right. Okay, so one in terms of radio spectrum is that we have a binding treaty with obligations amongst the member states. If we were to try to build it today, could we create a binding treaty with 193 member states on it to deal with the issues? We have the participation of the private sector through our sector membership. We have a master international frequency register that we maintain and that we include canceling frequency assignments if they're not in use. So in addition to looking at the assignments and that the applications are being made and doing the examination to ensure that they meet the regulations, but then we don't register them until they have been officially brought into use. And then if they are not being used, they either have to be suspended, or if they're not suspended and then brought back into use, or they can be canceled. So we rigorously ensure that the Master International Frequency Register actually reflects what is in use. Those are the kinds of things that I think if you're looking at other kinds of mechanisms, they might want to replicate. One that includes binding obligations, one that includes the participation of the private sector, the constituencies, as it were, one that includes, looking at enforcement from the context of being able to cancel something if it's not in use. And then also, of course, we have an appeal mechanism because of the Radio Regulations Board. So if things are not being, if there are infringements and so forth that are not being appropriately adjudicated, is there an appeal process? Or if, for instance, someone needs sort of, an extension of being able to bring something into use because of, force majeure. We've just gone through a period of COVID where we've had a lot of issues with bringing things into use on the time frames and so forth. Can you appeal that, and can you have an extension? That's an authority that the Bureau doesn't hold, but that the board does. So I think we can offer a lot of experience. I think we can offer some advice and guidance in terms of what we have learned has worked, based on having been built over more than 100 years of experience. But I don't think we should be trying to take on mandates that are outside of our technical competence or our resources or our authorities.
And that gets us to 2050.
Can I add one final thing?
I'd like for you to do that.
Okay, on your orbital debris, I think you've said really well. It is a shared responsibility, and I think we're all staying in our lanes. And at least I did want to clarify, the FCC licenses commercial satellites, but it doesn't mean that we're blind to what else is going on. So we coordinate with NASA, we coordinate with the FAA, Department of Commerce, and also we work with the National Space Council. So I want to make it clear that the US government knows that this is a shared responsibility. Our portion is commercial satellites, but we do work with the other agencies on where is everything. We need to have mitigation of the orbital debris, but also to make sure we're not colliding in space as well. So shared responsibility, it's our children's future in space that we need to protect.
Shared responsibility, whole of government, whole of community.
Whole of world.
You heard of how we're going to get to 2050 from a regulatory and policy perspective, at least some insights. And thank you for the very intrepid, as I said earlier, you continue to be members of this audience. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you.